The morning Stephanie handed him the divorce papers, Rourke didn't look up from his coffee. He just sat there at the kitchen table, the one with the uneven leg they'd never fixed, and stared at the rim of his mug like it might tell him something useful. Stephanie was already dressed for work, blazer, heels, the perfume she only wore when she was going somewhere she wanted to be seen. Standing behind her, in the doorway that led to the hall, was a man named Curtis, her colleague, her friend, the person she'd apparently been having dinner with 3 nights a week for 8 months. "You knew this was coming," Stephanie said. Her voice was patient in the way a person gets when they've rehearsed something too many times. "Don't make it harder than it has to be." Rourke looked at the papers. His name, her name, the word dissolution, and then a lot of language that reduced 11 years to a series of numbered paragraphs. He picked up a pen. He signed. Stephanie took the papers without ceremony, slid them into a folder she'd already prepared. The folder was already there, and said something about the lawyers handling the rest. Curtis said nothing. He just stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking at Rourke the way people look at something they've already decided isn't a threat. Their son, Theo, not the Theo in the file, a different one, Rourke's Theo, was 9 years old and asleep upstairs. He didn't know yet. He'd find out at breakfast, or maybe not until the weekend, depending on how Stephanie wanted to handle it. That was the part that sat in Rourke's chest like a stone. Not the papers. Not Curtis in the doorway. Theo. Rourke watched them leave from the kitchen window. Stephanie's car, the newer one, the one registered in her name, pulled out of the driveway and turned east toward downtown Halifax. Curtis followed in his own car. They didn't drive together. They were still being careful, even now. That detail, for some reason, was the one that stayed with him. He poured the rest of his coffee down the sink. Rourke had grown up in Dartmouth, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were close together, and everyone knew whose dad worked nights and whose mum cried on Sundays. He'd gone to Dal for 2 years, dropped out, worked on a fishing boat for a summer, then talked his way into an entry-level job at a small logistics company. By the time he was 28, he'd built a software platform that optimized freight routing for mid-sized carriers across Atlantic Canada. He sold it at 31 for more money than he knew how to think about. He didn't tell Stephanie. This requires some explanation. They'd been together for 3 years before the sale went through. She knew he worked in tech. She knew he was good at it. But Rourke had grown up around money that came and went. His father had made a lot of it twice and lost it twice, and the losing had been worse than if they'd never had it at all. Rourke had watched his father become a different person every time the tide changed. Louder when it came in, something quieter and harder to name when it went out. So when the acquisition closed and the funds cleared, and his lawyer congratulated him over the phone, in a voice that was almost reverent, Rourke didn't pop champagne. He set up a trust. He kept the money separate, managed quietly by a firm in Toronto, growing in the background the way a garden grows when no one's watching it. He kept working. Different company, lower title. He drove a 12-year-old Jeep with a crack in the dashboard and a heater that only worked on one side. He lived the life he'd always lived because the life he'd always lived was the life he actually wanted. And because he needed to know, he genuinely needed to know, whether the people around him wanted it too. It wasn't a test exactly. It was more like a question he didn't know how to ask out loud, and now he had his answer. Theo found out that weekend. Stephanie took him to her parents' place in Truro, sat him down in the living room with the floral couch and the photographs on the mantel, and explained that Mummy and Daddy weren't going to live together anymore. Theo was a quiet kid by nature, the kind who processed things internally before he let them out, which he'd gotten from Rourke. And so he listened, and he nodded, and he didn't cry until he was in the car on the way back to Halifax, when he thought Stephanie wasn't looking. She was looking. She told Rourke about it later, during one of the handoff conversations they had at the door, clipped and logistical, like dispatchers arranging a transfer. She didn't say it unkindly. That was the strange thing about Stephanie. She was never exactly unkind. She was just somewhere else. She'd been somewhere else for years, and Rourke had known it, and he'd hoped the somewhere else was temporary. And then one day he looked up, and the somewhere else had a name and a parking spot in their driveway. Rourke's weekends with Theo were the best part of his week. They'd drive out to Crystal Crescent Beach and throw rocks at the water. Not talking much, just being there. They'd stop at the Tim's on the way back and split a box of Timbits in the car, because Theo thought eating in the car was the peak of all human experience. They'd watch hockey on the couch with a blanket between them. Theo's feet tucked under Rourke's leg the way he'd done since he was 4 years old. One Saturday in November, Theo came home from school with a new backpack, the kind with a logo on it, the kind the other kids had, and a pair of sneakers that were scuffed on the right toe after less than a week. The left sole was starting to separate. Rourke noticed it when Theo kicked them off at the door. "Those need to be replaced," Rourke said. Theo shrugged. "They're fine. They're not fine. The sole's coming off." Theo looked at them, looked at Rourke. "It's okay, Dad. Mom said we'd get new ones next month." "Next month." Rourke looked at the shoes. $40 sneakers that had lasted less than 3 weeks, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite grief, and didn't have a clean name. He said, "We'll get them this weekend." I know you don't need them. I want to get them." They went to the mall on Saturday, and Theo picked out a pair of blue and white Nikes that he clearly loved and clearly felt guilty about loving, because he kept glancing at the price tag and back at Rourke with an expression that was too careful for a 9-year-old's face. "Dad, they're kind of expensive. I know. We don't have to." "Theo." Rourke crouched down to the boy's level, which still caught him off guard sometimes. How much crouching it required now. "Put the shoes on." Theo put the shoes on. He walked to the mirror at the end of the aisle and looked at himself. Something in his face went quiet and settled, the way faces do when something fits right. They bought the shoes. Rourke paid in cash. The thing about living below your means when you don't have to is that people fill in the blanks themselves. Stephanie's mother, Lorraine, had been filling in blanks about Rourke since 2014. She'd decided early on that he was unreliable, not malicious, just unfocused, the kind of man who would always be almost getting somewhere. When Rourke drove the old Jeep to family dinners, Lorraine's eyes would do a small flicker of a thing, quick and controlled, that said, "I was right about you," when the topic of money came up, which it always did, because Lorraine was the kind of person for whom money was a topic. She would find ways to direct the conversation toward Curtis, who worked in financial planning and wore clothes that fit him correctly. After the divorce, Lorraine stopped being quiet about it. She told Stephanie, who told Rourke during one of their clipped doorway conversations, that Lorraine had said Theo deserved better stability, that Rourke needed to get serious, that a man his age with no house of his own and a cracked dashboard was not building toward anything. Rourke listened to this, nodded, said he understood. He was renting a 2-bedroom apartment in the north end of Halifax. Clean, warm, close to Theo's school. The building wasn't new, and the hallway smelled faintly of carpet cleaner, but his apartment had good light in the morning, and a balcony where he grew tomatoes in the summer. It was more than enough. His portfolio at that point was sitting at 11 figures. Canadian. He went home and made pasta for dinner. The call came on a Tuesday in February. It came from Miriam, the woman who managed his trust, a precise, low-effect accountant from Mississauga, who communicated primarily in percentages and had once described a $40 million return as adequate. She was calling because a company called North Frame Logistics had been quietly failing for 18 months, and its board of directors had finally agreed to sell, and the sale price was the kind of number that even Miriam called about, rather than putting in an email. North Frame was the second largest freight carrier east of Ontario. They had contracts with 3 provincial governments, a fleet of 400 trucks, and a reputation that, despite recent troubles, remained solid. The asking price was significant. The potential, with the right restructuring, was considerably more significant. Rourke said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 4 days, which for him was a long time. On the 5th day he called Miriam back and said yes. The acquisition was completed quietly, the way he preferred things. No press release, no announcement, no name on a building. The new majority shareholder of North Frame Logistics was listed in the corporate filings under a numbered company that listed under a holding company that listed under a trust. The people who needed to know knew. Everyone else didn't. Then his lawyer, a man named Pritchard, who had handled the original sale and had since become something like a trusted friend, called him and said the story had leaked. A business journalist in Halifax had connected the dots: the trust, the holding company, the numbered company, and the name buried beneath all of them. Rourke Aldane, formerly of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, former same founder of Rootspark Inc., sold in 2019. Now majority owner of North Frame Logistics. The article went up on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Rourke's phone had received 47 calls from numbers he didn't recognize. He let them all go to voicemail and took Theo to a hockey game. Stephanie called on Sunday. He let it ring twice before he answered, out of habit rather than strategy. "I saw the article," she said. No preamble. Stephanie had never been a preamble person. "Okay, Rourke." "Yeah." A pause. He could hear her breathing, could hear the specific quality of silence that meant she was choosing her next words very carefully. "Why didn't you tell me?" He'd thought about this question for months. Not this specific phone call. He hadn't known there would be a phone call, but the question itself. He'd turned it around in his mind the way you turn a stone over and over until the edges get familiar. "Would it have changed anything?" he asked. That's not a fair question." "I know." Another pause, longer. "Curtis thinks I should talk to a lawyer," she said. "About the settlement. The settlement was already finalized." "I know, but the circumstances were different. You weren't disclosing, Stephanie." He said her name quietly, not hard. "The trust was set up before we were married. It was never marital property. My lawyer made sure of that. If Curtis wants to pursue something, he's welcome to. But I've already had that conversation and so can you." The silence that followed was not an angry one. It was the silence of someone recalibrating. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," he added. "I never was. I know," she said finally. And then, smaller, I didn't know who you were." "Yes, you did," Rourke said. "You just didn't want what he was worth." He didn't say it cruelly. He'd practiced saying it without cruelty for a long time. She hung up. He put the phone down on the counter and stood in his kitchen, looking at the tomato plants he'd brought inside for the winter, sitting on the sill in their little terracotta pots. Still going, still green. The business journalists wanted a profile. The lifestyle magazines wanted photographs. A podcast that covered Atlantic Canadian entrepreneurship reached out 3 separate times through 3 separate intermediaries. Rourke ignored all of it. What he did instead was fly to Toronto for a week and meet with North Frame's executive team. A group of people who had, to their credit, kept the company running through 18 months of financial turbulence with a combination of stubbornness and genuine competence. He sat across from them in a boardroom on the 42nd floor and listened more than he talked, which was his habit and also his method. And by the end of the 3rd day had a clear enough picture to begin. He restructured quietly, hired a new CFO, negotiated 3 new provincial contracts, found $18 million in operational waste that had been accumulating for years in the cracks between departments, the way dust accumulates behind furniture that never gets moved. He gave every long-service employee a raise. He did not put his name on anything. The people at North Frame started calling him the Ghost, in the way that people call someone something when they half mean it affectionately. His deputy, a woman named Ife, who had run logistics for the company through its worst year and had somehow never lost her composure, told him at the end of his first month that the staff had gone from demoralized to, and she chose the word carefully, hopeful. She said it like it was a data point she wanted him to have. Rourke said he appreciated that. She went back to work. So did he. Lorraine saw the article too. She called Stephanie, who told Rourke during the next handoff, and apparently the call had been long, and the tenor of it had shifted significantly, somewhere around the halfway mark. Lorraine now had opinions about how things had gone, about how Rourke had always seemed like a steady sort of person. actually, if you thought about it. About how these quiet types, you never knew, did you? Rourke heard this and felt nothing in particular. That was the thing he hadn't expected. Not anger, not satisfaction, not the vindicated feeling he might have imagined. Just a mild and fading interest, the way you feel about a story you read a long time ago. What he felt strongly about was Theo. Theo had seen the article too. A classmate's parent had mentioned it. And the classmate had mentioned it to Theo at school. And Theo had come home on Friday with a look on his face that Rourke recognized as the look of a person who had learned something significant and hadn't finished deciding how to feel about it yet. They sat on the couch after dinner. Hockey was on, but neither of them were watching it. Your friend Malik's mum told him something, Rourke said. Not a question. Theo looked at the TV. She said you own a company. A big one. I do now. Yeah, did you always have money? Rourke thought about how to answer that honestly and simply, the way you try to answer things for a 9-year-old when the honest, simple answer is also complicated. I had money before you were born, he said, but I didn't want it to change things. Theo was quiet for a moment. Then, change things how? How people treated us. How you grew up. I didn't want you to grow up thinking things just appear. That you don't have to work for them. That people like you because of what you have instead of who you are. Theo considered this with the serious expressions he always brought to serious things. But I wore shoes with a broken sole for 2 weeks, he said. There was no accusation in it. It was a statement of fact, offered as evidence in a case he was still building. Rourke felt it. He'd thought about the shoes a lot in the month since November. He'd gone over it many times. Whether he'd gone too far with the whole arrangement. Whether his principles had cost his son something they shouldn't have. I know, he said. That one I got wrong. Theo looked at him. I should have bought you the shoes sooner, Rourke said. No matter what I was trying to prove, you're a kid, and kids need shoes that work. That's on me. Theo nodded slowly, processing. I'm not going to tell you I had a perfect reason for everything. Rourke continued. I had reasons, and some of them were good, and some of them I'm still thinking about. But I want you to know, there was never a single day when I didn't have what you needed. If you needed something, I had it. I just didn't always show it the right way. The game went to commercial. A car ad played, then a phone plan, then one for a bank with a lot of soft music and people smiling at each other through windows. Are we going to move? Theo asked. Do you want to move? He thought about it. I like my room. We'll keep your room. And the Timbits thing on the way back from the beach? That stays. Theo seemed satisfied with this. He pulled the blanket over his feet and went back to watching the game, and Rourke sat beside him the way he always had. Close enough that when Theo shifted his weight he was leaning into him a little, the way he'd done since he was small. Spring came early to Halifax that year. Rourke walked to work some mornings, which was something he'd always done and would continue doing because the walk was 22 minutes, and he liked 22 minutes of quiet before the day started. He stopped at the same bakery on Gottingen Street, ordered the same dark roast, stood outside for a few minutes. With the cup in both hands the way you do when the weather is still finding itself. People in the neighborhood knew him now, the way they know someone who walks the same route long enough. The woman at the bakery remembered his order. The man at the dry cleaner around the corner nodded when he passed. The kids from the elementary school 2 blocks over sometimes ran past him in the mornings, loud and scattered, and one of them once dropped a mitten and Rourke picked it up and held it out, and the kid grabbed it without breaking stride and kept going, like this was an entirely normal transaction, which it was. He thought sometimes about the version of this story that people like to tell, the one where the man gets everything and the woman who left him regrets it, and justice arrives on schedule like a very satisfying train. He understood why people liked that story. It was clean. It had weight on both ends. But the real version was quieter. Stephanie had remarried within a year. Curtis, predictably, had proposed, and she seemed, from what Rourke could observe at handoffs and school pickups, genuinely content. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He'd spent a long time waiting to feel something clean and final about the whole thing, and the clean, final feeling never quite arrived. What arrived instead was a Tuesday in April, when Theo scored his first goal in House League hockey, and the look on his face, pure, uncalculated, a 9-year-old's whole body becoming one big expression of yes, was something Rourke was quite certain he would carry for the rest of his life. What arrived was a Saturday morning in May when Rourke sat on the balcony with his coffee, the tomatoes just starting back up in their terracotta pots, the harbor visible between two buildings if you angled your head right, and he looked at the sky going pink over Dartmouth across the water and thought, not for the first time and not with any particular fanfare, this is enough. This is actually enough. He'd started something real with North Frame. Jobs saved, a few hundred of them, in communities that needed them. He'd done it without any headlines and without any speeches, and without putting his name on anything that didn't need his name on it. He drove his Jeep. He ate Timbits in the car with his kid. He walked to work in the mornings and stood outside the bakery on Gottingen Street and held his coffee in both hands. And on a Tuesday evening in the middle of spring, when the city was finally warm enough to have the windows open, Theo called from Stephanie's place to say goodnight and said, "Hey Dad, Malik's brother says you're the richest guy in Halifax." "Is that true?" Rourke thought about it for a moment. "I don't know about richest," he said, "but I'm doing all right." Theo thought about this with the great seriousness he applied to questions that mattered. "Okay," he said finally. "That's pretty good." "Yeah," Rourke said, "it is."